Funny how we look at Eddie and think we already know who he is, right? The fragile boy, full of rules, limits, and medicines. But when you get a little closer, you realize he is a walking paradox. While he tries to protect himself from the world, he ends up becoming even more vulnerable. And that says a lot about us, too. Because deep down, who has never lived trapped in fears that seemed like absolute truths, but were placed there by someone, and that is where his analysis becomes irresistible. Understanding Eddie is almost like opening a shortcut to understand the fears we hide ourselves. And when you see how Pennywise uses every insecurity and every emotional crack, almost like a hacker entering through an obvious password, you start to realize that this story is not just about a character. It is about you, about me, about everyone who once believed in limits that never existed. If you are a fan of movies and psychology and want to understand the mind behind your favorite character, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss any video. But first, comment below which character you want me to analyze here on the channel. Now let us go to the video. Eddie Kaspbrak is the kind of boy who seems to have been born inside a medicine leaflet, literally. Since he was very young, he was conditioned to believe that the outside world is a minefield full of germs, diseases, and invisible dangers, and it is not hard to understand why. His mother, an overprotective and emotionally manipulative woman, practically made hypochondria the official language of the house. Eddie grew up afraid of everything except obeying. Imagine living your childhood believing that any breeze could knock you down. That is how Eddie lived, surrounded by inhalers, tissues, and medicines, some real and others invented. He believed he was constantly sick, but what he truly had was a mother who needed him to believe that. A toxic relationship disguised as care, but that actually kept him trapped in an invisible cage made of fear and dependence. The most curious thing is that Eddie, deep down, was not weak. He only seemed to be. You know that person who learned to protect themselves so much that they forgot they also know how to fight? He is exactly that. Always the most scared one in the group, the most hesitant, but also the most loyal. Because deep down, he wanted to prove to himself that he could be more than the fragile boy his mother said he was. The town of Derry, with its secrets and horrors, was the perfect setting for this boy to try to discover who he really is. While other kids were afraid of monsters, Eddie was afraid of coughing. But it is in this contrast that his story becomes so human, because we all have our own internal Pennywises, and his hid behind a mask of care. The irony is that Eddie's fear was always sold to him as love, and that is brutal, because when someone grows up believing that control is the same as affection, the outside world becomes a threat. And that is when he begins to break inside, wanting to be free but afraid to breathe without permission, even surrounded by friends. Eddie was the type who tried to solve everything by following the rules, as if life had an instruction manual. But Derry has no manual. Pennywise has no protocol. And it is exactly in this chaos that Eddie begins to realize that perhaps the danger is not in the germs, but in the people who taught him to fear them. Strangely, even as an adult, he carries this pattern. A man with a fear of living, trapped in a safe routine, trying to avoid any kind of discomfort. And that is exactly what makes the reunion with the past so symbolic, because it is not just about facing the clown, but about facing everything he stopped being. And look, there is something fascinating here. The fragile boy who grew up believing he needed medicines to survive will discover that the real antidote for fear does not come from a pharmacy. But hold on, that is a topic for the next point. And to understand the weight of this trauma, we need to open the childhood medicine box. The trauma of overprotection and maternal manipulation. Eddie grew up believing the world was a constant threat and that only his mother knew how to protect him. But her care was a prison disguised as affection. She kept him sick to keep him close, with every cough a "see how I am," right? And when a mother makes her son doubt his own body, what remains is a boy afraid even to breathe without permission. The cruelest part of manipulation is that it does not scream, it whispers. "I just want what is best for you," she said, while planting in Eddie's mind the idea that the outside world would kill him. This shapes a child. It makes them grow up thinking that freedom is the same as danger. And love, in this case, becomes a psychological game where safety costs one's autonomy. When you live around someone else's anxiety, you start to believe that your health depends on their control. And that is how Eddie learned to obey, not out of respect, but out of fear. It is the same fear that makes many adults follow rules that no longer make sense just because someone long ago said it was for their own good. Deep down, his body knew he was fine, but his mind was a hostage. The problem is that when love comes with guilt, we learn to feel wrong for wanting to be free. Eddie wanted to play, get dirty, run with his friends, but his mother reminded him of the inhaler, the care, the warnings, and little by little he traded curiosity for fear, spontaneity for caution, and the world became a battlefield against infections that only existed in her mind. There is a curious point here. Eddie's fear is actually his mother's distorted love reflected in him. It is almost poetic, the poison being delivered as medicine. He grew up thinking that fragility was a virtue and strength was rebellion, and this is more common than it seems. How many people do you know who still ask for permission to be who they are, just to avoid disappointing someone? What gets me the most is that Eddie truly believed he was sick, that he needed all of that the inhaler was a shield. And that is what manipulation does. It confuses your sense of truth. Because when fear is taught from childhood, it becomes part of your identity. And when you try to get rid of it, you feel as if you are betraying the person who raised you. But somewhere in his unconscious, he knew something was wrong in that relationship. That is why, when the Losers Club enters his life, Eddie begins to taste autonomy. For the first time, he breathes for real. And he realizes that maybe, just maybe, the air outside is not as toxic as he was told. And that is where Pennywise enters, ready to explore what his mother left as a gift, the fear of vulnerability. Because if there is one thing the clown understands well, it is how to turn traumas into tools. But that we will break down in the next topic. The trauma of the fear of vulnerability and loss of control. Eddie was always terrified of losing control. For him, being in command meant being safe, and anything outside of that was pure chaos. This fear was born back in the arms of a mother who did not allow mistakes and turned every choice into a possible disaster. So he grew up believing that making mistakes was the same as danger, that being vulnerable was the same as opening a breach for the world to hurt him. But what happens when you try to control everything all the time? Life becomes a giant emotional chess match. Eddie became the friend who always has a plan, an escape route, a justification, all of it just to avoid feeling. And the saddest part is that this armor did not protect him. It only isolated him. Because deep down, the fear of getting hurt is also the fear of allowing yourself to live. Vulnerability is scary because it demands surrender. And Eddie never learned what that is. He grew up believing that emotional dependence was weakness and total autonomy was survival. But the problem is that no one survives alone for long. He wanted to be strong, but in the process, he ended up becoming a prisoner of his own rigidity, a soldier fighting a war against enemies that only existed inside him. And it is interesting to think how this fear appears in the body, right? Eddie lived on alert. His heart raced, his chest tightened, his breath failed. Physical symptoms of a mind that never rested. And we see this in so many people, those who need everything under control because if something goes off script, the ground disappears. It is the fear of uncertainty disguised as precaution. Deep down, what Eddie feared the most was emotional collapse. He believed that if he ever fell apart, no one would help him get up. So he stayed firm, ironic, rational, as if humor were a disguise for despair. He is the kind of person who jokes all the time, but if you look closely, is always on the verge of crying. The joke is just a shield, and the laughter an anesthetic. This pattern shapes all his relationships. Eddie approaches people carefully, but never fully opens up, because if he allows himself to feel, everything might fall apart. It is the same mechanism that makes someone avoid serious conversations, avoid falling in love, or pull away when the bond gets too deep. The fear of losing control is the fear of being truly seen, and the most poetic part of all this is that what he tries to avoid is exactly what he needs the most: vulnerability. Because only when he begins to break his own defenses does he truly live something genuine with his friends, and especially with Richie. It is there, in the cracks of courage, that the real Eddie appears. A sweet, sensitive, and brave boy hiding behind the fear of feeling. But of course, Pennywise knows every crack in that armor, and he will use all of it against him, especially this terror of losing control. After all, what could be more terrifying for Eddie than facing his own body collapsing in the face of fear? How Pennywise uses his fears and traumas to scare him. Pennywise never appears by chance. He is the distorted mirror of the unconscious, and in Eddie's case, a mirror full of bacteria, coughs, and fear of human contact. The clown knows that his fear is not of dying but of losing control. So he attacks right there in the weakness his mother built with such care. Every scare from Pennywise is a cruel reminder that danger can come from inside rather than outside. When Eddie sees that grotesque figure spitting blood and rot, what he sees is the materialization of what he always believed was deadly contamination. The monster does not need to touch him. Threatening his purity is enough and he falls apart. It is as if Pennywise were saying, "You think you are safe in your sterilized world? Then face me now." His fear is not visual, it is symbolic. The panic of losing the illusion of safety, and the most perverse part is that Pennywise perfectly understands the mother's role in this equation. He takes advantage of it. The phrases he says, the tone, even the gestures, everything echoes the maternal manipulation. It is as if Eddie's own mother had grown sharp teeth and a red smile. The clown is not just the monster. He is the care that became a prison, the affection that became poison, and Eddie feels this in his body. There is a moment when the terror becomes almost intimate, because what Pennywise provokes in him is not only fear, it is shame. Shame of being fragile, of needing others, of still feeling like that helpless little boy. He tries to hide it with jokes, but inside he is imploding. And this is where the psychological terror becomes deeper. The fear of the clown mixes with the fear of himself. The fascinating part is that Pennywise does not need to create anything new. He only turns on the lights inside Eddie's mind and leaves him trapped there. The claustrophobia, the disgust, the panic, it was all already inside him, waiting for a trigger. And this is how trauma works. It is not the monster entering you, it is you reliving what you never managed to purge. Pennywise is only the conductor of the internal orchestra. Eddie tries to fight, but his rational logic is useless against the irrational. The inhaler, his symbolic shield, becomes a fake weapon. The scene in which he uses it against Pennywise is almost poetic. He discovers that the medicine never had any power. The strength was always inside him. But to understand this, he needs to face his own fear head-on. Without his mother, without a mask, without jokes. The most ironic part is that Pennywise unintentionally ends up being the most brutal therapist Eddie could have, because he forces him to see the origin of everything that haunts him. The manipulation, the fear, the control, and he makes him realize that in order to be free, he needs to allow himself to feel. It hurts, but it is liberating. It is the moment when the fragile boy begins to become a man, and fear finally becomes fuel. But calm down, Eddie's story does not end in the scare. Because the most interesting part is not what haunts him, but what he chooses to do with it afterward. And this is where his true emotional arc begins. The arc of a man trying to understand who he is when fear no longer sets the rhythm. Eddie is the kind of person who spends his life trying to look stronger than he feels. And this comes directly from his childhood. When you grow up in an environment where fear is constant, you learn to survive rather than live. He becomes the kind of guy who needs to control everything, the plans, the people, the emotions, because if something falls out of place, the panic returns. And the panic is the reminder that deep down he is still the boy trapped in a room full of medicine. This need for control shapes every relationship he has. He is the friend who wants to make sure everyone is fine, the one who always has a first aid kit, not only a physical one, but an emotional one. He tries to fix the world around him because he never learned to fix what he feels inside. And this is a dilemma many people face, living in survival mode, trying to organize the chaos so they do not have to look inside it. The irony is that this hypervigilance, which he thinks protects him, distances him from others, because when you try too hard to look fine, no one notices that you need help. And Eddie carries this through humor. He turns fear into jokes, trauma into irony, discomfort into sarcasm. It is his way of saying, I am fine, even when he is not. And who has never done that? With time, he becomes an expert at avoiding vulnerability. He prefers logic over feeling, calculation over intuition. And this is where the tragedy lies, because while he tries to protect himself from the pains of life, he also protects himself from the joys. A safe life is a life without risks, but also without intensity. And Eddie, without realizing it, lives in the shallow end out of fear of drowning. But living with the losers changes everything. It is with them that he begins to realize that strength does not lie in never feeling fear, but in feeling it and acting anyway. It is as if for the first time someone said, you do not have to be the strong one all the time. And this is one of the most powerful lessons in his story: the courage to be fragile even when the world said otherwise. These traumas shape Eddie into a man who is extremely loyal, but also full of self-demand. He blames himself for things he cannot control, sabotages himself when he is too happy, and lives waiting for the moment everything will go wrong. It is almost as if his brain had a radar for tragedy, and this happens to many people who grew up in unpredictable environments. Peace feels suspicious. But the most beautiful part is that even with all these wounds, he never stops loving. He cares, protects, and is capable of genuine acts of courage, because deep down, his greatest strength comes from empathy, from understanding the fear of others because he knows his own. Eddie is the kind of person whose heart is patched all over, and maybe that is why it beats so strongly. And this heart will be brutally tested when he must choose between fear and love, between the instinct to protect himself and the desire to protect those he loves. Because the greatest test of Eddie's life is still to come, and it is there that he will find out who he truly is. The relationship with Richie and the fear of feeling the relationship between Eddie and Richie is one of those that are born disguised as a joke, but carry an emotional weight only silence understands. Between one tease and another, there is a bond that goes beyond friendship. It is as if Richie were the only one capable of seeing Eddie behind the mask of control. But Eddie, of course, does not know how to handle this, because feeling too much has always been a synonym for danger to him. Affection, no matter how genuine, triggers the same internal alarm as fear. Richie is noise, chaos, the opposite of the controlled routine Eddie needs so much, and maybe this is why he destabilizes him so deeply. Eddie tries to keep emotional distance, but Richie's gaze breaks through all his defenses. It is the kind of connection that does not need to be said, only lived. And this is what scares Eddie the most, not being able to rationalize what he feels. Love for him is fear disguised as affection. His whole life he learned that intense feelings hurt, that loving too much is opening a wound. So he represses it, pretends he does not understand, laughs at the jokes, throws sarcasm back, but his body gives him away. The gaze lingers longer, the laugh gets more nervous. It is a war between what he feels and what he learned to feel ashamed of feeling. And this repression is a kind of prison, just as strong as his mother's control. Richie, on the other hand, is the mirror of what Eddie does not allow himself to be: authentic, open, imperfect. And this enchants and terrifies him at the same time, because when he is near Richie, the world seems simpler, the rules fade, the fears shrink. But along with the lightness comes guilt. That internal voice saying, do not get too involved, do not be vulnerable, as if loving someone were a relapse. The most beautiful and tragic part is that the love between them is a silent scream. And I understand you that never becomes a full sentence. And this hurts. Because the Eddie who wants to be free finds freedom exactly in the place where he most fears falling, in affection. Their connection is a constant reminder that fear and love come from the same root. Both require surrender. Eddie spends a good part of his life running from what he feels, trying to keep his rationality intact. But love is the kind of emotion that does not fit inside a sterilized bottle. It escapes. And this is where the conflict lives. The more he tries to protect himself, the more he distances himself from what heals him. Richie represents this invitation to real life, to feel, to fail, to cry, to love, and, ironically, to fall ill with what is truly worth it. Emotion, deep down, Eddie knows. He knows that what he feels is not ordinary friendship, but he also knows that to admit this, he would need to face what is most frightening inside him, his own humanity. This is a dilemma many people live, loving in silence to avoid being hurt, pretending indifference to avoid losing the little control that remains. But love, unlike fear, always finds a way to be noticed, and this almost love between them becomes Eddie's biggest wound and at the same time his greatest strength. Because when fear tries to dominate him, it is Richie's memory that makes him act, and in the end, the love he never managed to say out loud will scream in every act of courage. And it is at this point that the story begins to walk toward its most intense climax. The sacrifice and the awakening of courage. There comes a moment when the Eddie who always ran from danger needs to face it head on. And it is curious how life seems to have a sense of irony. The boy who grew up thinking everything could kill him chooses in the end to risk everything to save his friends. It is there, in the face of fear, that he understands that courage is not the absence of fear, but acting even while trembling. And for the first time, Eddie is not trying to protect himself. He is trying to protect others. The moment of sacrifice is almost symbolic, as if his whole story converged into this all his life. Fear controlled every step, and now he chooses the opposite, the leap. It is an act of liberation, a shouted enough at everything that kept him trapped. And it is in this moment that the fragile Eddie gives way to the heroic Eddie, not through physical strength, but through emotional decision. He chooses to feel even knowing the price. The most touching part is that in this moment, he is not only facing Pennywise, he is facing his mother, his trauma, his guilt, his entire past. Every strike he lands on the clown is as if he were saying, "You do not rule me anymore." It is the body reacting where once there was only paralysis, and it is impossible not to be moved, seeing someone who lived oppressed by fear finally breathe freely, even if for one last moment. This scene is the synthesis of his emotional journey. Eddie is not driven by anger, but by love. It is love that makes him return, fight, stay. And ironically, it is this same love, the one he never confessed, that makes him invincible for a moment. Fear does not disappear, but it loses its power. And psychologically speaking, this is the true cure, when fear still exists, but you no longer obey it. It is beautiful to think that Eddie, who spent his whole life thinking he needed medicine to survive, discovers in that moment that the antidote was always inside him. It was not an inhaler, it was courage. And courage sometimes is doing what needs to be done, even when you know it will hurt. It is choosing others over your own comfort. It is understanding that living truly requires surrender. There is something deeply human in this scene, fear and love living side by side. And when Eddie falls, what remains is not the sensation of loss, but of redemption. He dies free, free from control, guilt, dependency, free to feel, to fail, to love, even if for a second. And this freedom is what transforms him from a victim into a symbol. He does not run from fear, he goes through it. And this is where his story becomes a mirror for us. Because we all have an Eddie inside us, that part that hides behind fear, thinking it is not enough. But there comes a time when life demands courage, and we need to decide who will be in charge, fear or the will to live. Eddie chose to live even knowing he might not make it out. And in the end, the boy who spent his whole life trying not to die finally learned what it means to be alive. And this emotional turning point, this moment of total surrender, changes everything. Because the Eddie who falls there is not the same who entered. And what comes after this is where his true legacy begins to form. And now, tell me what you thought of this dive into Eddie's mind. Did you manage to notice any little part of him that speaks to any little part of you too? Because honestly, it is impossible to analyze this character without touching something very real about ourselves. And now I am curious, what was the point that hits you the most? And also tell me which character you want to see in the next analysis on the channel. It can be from another story, hero, villain, supporting character. You choose, because these conversations only get good when you join in too. And if you want to keep understanding the psychology behind characters in a light, deep, and zero boring way, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way you will not miss the next deep dive, and I will not be talking alone in there.